everybody hear me? Excellent. Good evening and welcome to Junior Colloquia. I'm Julia Downing. This is Eddie Chang and Karena Bucco. We will be presenting on behalf of Team Nature under the mentorship of Dr. Bing Hu. Nature stands for Nanopaper Applications to Universalized Renewable Electronics, and we're excited to introduce you to our project, which paves the way towards new eco-friendly electronics. And what does that mean? Okay. Sorry about that. As a brief overview, we're going to proceed through our project chronologically. We'll begin by framing the background of our research problem and its importance before diving into a breakdown of our methodology, briefing you on our current progress, and then providing information to the rising sophomores on how to handle their new teams. So now I will move into a description of our research background. Many of you have smartphones sitting in your pockets or a tablet sitting on your desk at home. We use these devices many times throughout the day, yet we don't often think about where they come from. The reality is that a large portion of the materials that go into making your smartphone are plastics, and plastics are unfortunately refined using a process that relies on fossil fuels. Furthermore, approximately 50% of these plastics are produced for single-use applications, which means they require even more fossil fuels to produce additional products. So, can we find a material that replaces plastics that doesn't have this high environmental price tag? The answer might be closer than you think. Freshmen, please look at the paper that you are writing on as we speak. This paper is comprised of bundles of a fiber called cellulose on the micro scale. Oops. They have a diameter of 20 to 50 micrometers. If you were to make a paper out of fibers with a fiber diameter several orders of magnitude smaller, you would get a paper that is transparent because the fibers do not scatter visible light. This material is called cellulose nanopaper, and we think it's the answer to this problem. So why should you care about CNP, as we call it? First of all, it has a transparency comparable to plastic. It also has a mechanical strength that far outstrips plastic in terms of its maximum loading stress. With regards to thermal stability, it has a low coefficient of thermal expansion, which is very important for electronic applications. And finally, as we've discussed, it's an abundant and renewable source material alternative. So this brings us to our research questions. What properties of CNP can be improved? And how can we enhance them to optimize the material for various printed electronic applications, such as flexible solar cells and batteries? So now I'll give you a brief overview of how we identified these areas of improvement. Upon conducting a literature review, we found that the traditional starting material for CNP is softwood pine. However, there are other materials out there, such as jute, that may be an even better candidate. In terms of mechanical strength, CNP is a highly porous and layered nanostructure, and this is what makes it so strong. However, it needs further strengthening for some of the roll-to-roll printing and flexible electronic applications we desire. With regards to water stability, when you think of paper, it disintegrates in water, which isn't very good if you're trying to make a solar cell out of paper. So we also looked into methods to increase the hydrophobicity of water, making it more afraid of water. CNP is also a natural insulator, but we researched methods to make it conductive with coatings of conductive materials such as silver nanowires and graphene. And finally, with regards to functionality, we researched methods to make our paper a clean slate upon which a variety of electronic structures can be built. So this brings us to our methodology. The first step was to create our own samples of CNP. And then our team divided into 4 distinct sub-teams that focused on implementing treatments to address the 4 areas of starting material, functionality, which we addressed with atomic layer deposition, esterification, which increases hydrophobicity, and conductive coatings. We will then perform a variety of property tests to characterize our improvements on the paper's properties. And now Eddie will take us to the current status of our research.
Thanks, Julia. So the first step of our project was to actually create cellulose nanopaper. And for us, we had to first select the source of cellulose. For us, this has always traditionally been softwood pine pulp. In the next 2 steps, known as tempo oxidation and microfluidization, we use chemical and mechanical methods to reduce the fiber diameter from the scale of microns to about 10 to 20 nanometers. And this plays a huge role in reducing or increasing the transparency of cellulose nanopaper. By this point, we will obtain nanofiber suspensions, which are essentially nanofibers of diameter 10 to 20 nanometers in water. And this is the material that we use to actually create the cellulose nanopaper in a process known as casting. And essentially this process, we pour the suspension into a smooth container. It's smooth because we want the nanopaper to be smooth, so that when all the liquid dries out, we will be able to peel off the finished cellulose nanopaper, as you see in step 6. And so a lot of our work during the past and current semesters has been devoted to obtaining cellulose nanofiber suspensions. And you can see in the photo, it's a clear liquid. It looks almost like water, except it's a little more viscous. And the weight concentration can vary from about 0.5 to 1.5 weight% of cellulose. And using the suspension, this semester actually, we ran our first attempt, our casting attempt to actually create cellulose nanopaper. And to do this, we poured a certain amount of the suspension into a petri dish, which we selected as our smooth container, evaporated all the water under controlled humidity and temperature conditions, and peeled off the resulting product, which you see in the photo that we're holding the tweezers. And we ran this trial with non-ideal conditions. So we noticed some problems, such as bubble formation in the final paper. And you can see there are little specks in the paper, which are actually the bubbles. And we think that this resulted from using the non-optimal values of humidity and temperature, which would cause the water to evaporate more quickly than we could allow. In addition, the resulting paper was too thin, indicating that we needed to increase the concentration of our suspension or use more suspension in our casting process. And so since this time, we've attempted the casting process numerous other times, and each time have learned something new to optimize the process. For instance, we've since learned that the optimal humidity and temperature to run the process are about 53.3% relative humidity and 30 degrees Celsius. And this gives us the optimal rate of drying the suspension while avoiding formation of bubbles in the final paper. In addition, we've decided to begin concentrating our CNF suspensions to 1 to 1.5 weight% for use, as we've decided that this will ultimately speed up the whole casting process. And most recently, we've decided to begin coating our substrate with PDMS, which will serve as a hydrophobic layer between the nanopaper and substrate, and make the resulting nanopaper easier to peel off, as we've had problems peeling off the nanopaper from glass substrates. So after we obtain cellulose nanopaper, the real part of our project begins, applying treatments and processes to the paper to improve its individual properties. Some properties like electrical conductivity and water stability. In this section, conductive coatings, we use carbon nanotube and graphene coatings to introduce electrical conductivity to paper, which is an insulator. And we chose these materials because they have great electrical conductivity. For nanotubes, which are a one-dimensional material, we see that they have great conductivity along their tube direction. And for 2D materials like graphene, they have excellent conductivity on their sheet area. And so we think these are good candidates to increase the conductivity of nanopaper. And the motive for this, improving this property of paper is that to be applied in electronics, nanopaper must be conductive, of course, and that coatings are a good way to do this, since other methods like composite papers, by altering the base material, this also increases conductivity, but it really tanks the transmittance of the paper, which we think is an integral property of the paper. Our goal in this section of the project is to apply carbon nanotube and graphene coatings to cellulose nanopaper and measure the resulting sheet resistance and transparency, where sheet resistance is just a measure of the conductivity of a 2D material. Our methodology is fairly straightforward. We want to create suspensions of the conductive material, which in this case is CNTs or graphene, where CNTs means carbon nanotubes. We then cast a sample of nanopaper, cast the appropriate amount of conductive material on top, peel off the sample and run any analysis that we need to. This is just a diagram showing how we went about creating our carbon nanotubing. And we basically mixed the carbon nanotubes with water and a certain amount of surfactant, subjected it to sonication, and leading to the final ink, which you see in the bottom right image. And while we haven't actually used this ink to create transparent carbon nanotube coatings, we believe we can potentially predict the transparency of these coatings before even applying them, using something known as Beer's law, which addresses the absorbance of any substance. And as you can see, Beer's law is stated in the top right here. Absorbance is equal to epsilon times L times C. And in the case of carbon nanotube films, we can say that L, the path length, is equal to the thickness of the film. C, the concentration is just weight%, so it would be 1 for a CNT film. And by calculating epsilon from measurements from our CNT ink, we can potentially predict the absorbance of carbon nanotube thin films. Another section of our project, esterification, seeks to improve the water stability of the paper. As it is, when when cellulose nanopaper absorbs water, it becomes very weak and disintegrates into individual fibers. And so the motive for this project is that in order to apply nanopaper in certain applications like touchscreens or solar cells, it has to be stable to water contact. And the idea behind this section of the project is that originally, cellulose nanopaper has groups of hydroxyl on the surfaces of the fibers, and the issue is that these hydroxyl groups are polar, and water molecules are also polar, meaning that they both attract. But if we replace the hydroxyl groups with non-polar ester groups, then we can increase the water stability of the surface and hopefully make it more resistant to water. So the goal here, like I said, is to change the hydroxyl groups to ester groups. And essentially our initial methodology planned to run this reaction on all fibers in solution. But after attempting this, we ran into a problem, which was that cellulose nanofibers did not disperse in a certain chemical as we had hoped. And so our approach to this is to reconsider our methodology. Instead of running the process on all fibers in solution, we've decided to run the process on finished paper and only on the surface of the paper, since that's the only area of the paper which should come in contact with water. And so the current status of this section of the project is that it's awaiting finished casted nanopaper in order to run this surface esterification reaction. And now my teammate Corinna will take over and talk about the future directions of our project.
Thank you, Eddie. And like Eddie said, I'll be talking about the future directions of our team, the budget, team organization, and the challenges we've encountered. So while not detailed here on this slide, we will be refining our CMP casting process so that we can complete our esterification and conductive coating experiments for this semester. Going into the spring, we'll be moving into the second phase of our project, which includes fabricating CMP using jute fibers, as listed here, and utilizing atomic layer definition so that we may characterize our samples of CMP with the property tests we mentioned before, such as tensile testing and spectrophotometry. Then into the summer of 2016, we'll begin drafting our senior thesis paper with the data we collect from the spring. And hopefully in the fall of 2016, we'll be able to present at a conference. As for our monetary expenses, this is our budget. We're well under budget and currently on track for spending. We have obtained our funds for our lab supplies, chemicals, and planned conference through Launching Deep, which I'll touch on in a bit. And our balance remains at a healthy $5,500. So Launch UMD. Here's a snapshot of the end result of our campaign. Launch UMD is a university crowdfunding platform, and through this resource, which we recommend to future teams in Gemstone, we obtained the necessary funds for our research and then some, which we incorporated into our budget as extra supplies and a planned conference visit. Now, as for our challenges and drawbacks, we've encountered many challenges throughout this process. For one, our early attempts at completing our treatments were not as ideal as hoped, as we were still developing our skills as researchers. For example, this picture here shows an early casting attempt of CMP. This sample is too thin, filled with bubbles, and therefore unusable. And, even though we've learned a lot from these initial stages, we're still developing our skills as researchers and technically have more room to grow. We also know that we have 3 years for this research project, but it may seem like a long time, but it's not. And we've had lots of scheduling conflicts and unexpected challenges like broken equipment, which have hindered our progress and delayed our timeline. But this goes into our team dynamics. After realizing that we were behind with our team initial timeline, we decided to install 2 project managers to monitor the progress of our sub-teams. And we individually hold each other accountable for the work we do and make sure that we attend all of our meetings, we respect each other's contributions, and for advice for freshmen, we ask that you create many contingency plans and maintain flexibility when things don't go as expected. So in conclusion, to reiterate, Team Nature would like to complete all of our proposed treatments for our project by the end of the junior year, and so that we may draft our senior thesis paper in the spring. And we hope that with this, we can contribute to the long-term goals of CMP research
including the applications within electronics such as printed circuit solar cells, so that we may solve the sustainability issues posed by plastics and electronics. And with this, we thank you for your time.